Okay, thanks a lot. So as you can understand, I'm Ukrainian as well. And I heard this narrative like Putin said several times, and he's keeping to say it like modern Ukraine was created by Russia. And what does it mean? I mean, like, I've learned history at school and nobody said it to us. And now he's using it every time he gives speech. And I think that every person who lives in Russia, they believe that it was built because Russia did it. I mean, like, and what is he referring to? And where do Ukraine themselves see the origins of the country? Is it Cossacks, or I don't know, what would you say about it?
Thank you. It's a very good question. And actually, with this question, we address this common perhaps myth or even misunderstanding when this idea of one people, you know, Russia, like kind of Ruski and Российский, one kind of this idea of one people of all Russians came into being, and there is this perhaps from the Moscow perspective of what Russian president or like the entire leadership, what they try to promote is to say that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians were always one people. But actually, when we look at the sources, we understand how constructed this notion is, because this idea of a great Russian nation to which let's say, as they were called, Russians, little Russians, and white Russians belong, was just a modern construct of Russian ideologists and Russian historians, and it first appears in the work by Nikolai Karamzin, the official historian of Russian Empire, called The History of the Russian State, published between 1781 and 1826. So you can actually see how recent this concept is. And Karamzin developed this argument according to which the territory of Russia and Ukraine was that of one Slavic Russian people, and basically spreading over the territory of the Kievan Rus. I don't know if I well, I would perhaps say a little bit more about the Kievan Rus, because in your question you asked me, where do Ukrainians themselves see the origin of their state? I would say that also the narrative, the historical narrative that is being promoted in Ukraine is this perhaps very nationalistic approach to try to find the origin of the Ukrainian state as far back as possible. And this is why Ukrainian history, as it is taught at school and even at the university level, would go not to the Cossacks, but even further still, also to the kind of to the Middle Ages, to the Kievan Rus, this Orthodox proto-state centered around Kiev. And as I mentioned already, at its largest extent, it spread from the Black Sea to the Lake Ladoga, like kind of occupying the entire territory of Ukraine, but also the European Russia. And more importantly, it was also a cradle of orthodoxy, because Volodymyr the Great, as we call him, Volodymyr Veliki, the Grand Prince of Kiev, he adopted Christianity from Byzantine in 988. And this is very important for Ukrainians, but also for Russians. And this is also one of the examples of how history can be manipulated. Because I don't know, Volodymyr, if you know this, there is always kind of this legend of Andriy Первозванный coming to Kiev, to the the hills of Kiev, and saying that this is a holy place, and so on and so on. So this heritage is as important to Ukrainians as to Russians, but in the Russian case, there is this idea that Volodymyr brought Christianity and thus created this common spiritual space of orthodoxy, as opposed to Roman Catholicism, right? Because obviously Poland, Lithuania, and other neighbors to the west were Roman Catholic. So it provided the origin for a different civilization, and this is why we also hear in Russian discourse those idea of civilizational choice, that we are a different civilization, we are opposing the West, and so on. Moscow was also called as the Third Rome. So it all kind of comes together in these terms. But I already referred to this official narrative, kind of the very nationalistic narrative of history writing in modern Ukraine, where we see history as a succession of different forms of statehood, as an evolution of consecutive phases leading up towards independence in 1991. And from this perspective, after Kievan Rus, we have obviously the Halych-Volhynia Principality, which was split between Lithuania and Poland, and following their union, the union between Kingdom of Poland and the Principality of Lithuania in 1569, and the creation of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, almost all territory of today's Ukraine fell under their rule. And this is interesting that this is in this context, in the context of Ukrainian lands being part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that we have this important episode, the Cossack uprisings, the Cossack autonomy, the Cossack state. And the Ukrainian Cossacks, they were basically, this was they created an autonomy on southeastern frontiers of the Commonwealth. Also, they played an important military function, defensive function against the Ottomans, against the kind of Islam, against Muslim, and so on and so on. And at some point, because Polish-Lithuania, they basically, perhaps we can say that they disrespect this autonomy, and there was a discrimination against Orthodox Church, which was also very important for the Cossacks. The Cossacks, headed by Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they rebelled again against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and at some point they needed to look for some kind of alliances, and they turned to Orthodox Moscow, because they felt that there was some kind of perhaps they would support Cossacks because of the faith that they shared. And this is how we come to the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654. And I don't know if you want to speak of it separately, or if I should continue. So just let me know.
Yeah, maybe before we speak about the agreement, I have one more question about the Cossacks, because I have heard their name a lot in the context of freeing slaves. Yeah, can you tell us about that, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, because the Cossacks, they bordered the Ottoman Empire, right, the Crimean Khanate at the same time. So there were a lot of those episodes when Muslims would come and to Ukraine, basically to the territory of like kind of the territory populated by today's Ukrainians, we could say, and but yeah, taking young women, selling them on markets in Crimea, and this was also one of the tasks of the Cossacks to fight against those forms of invasion. And we can also hear there are also a lot of references to this in the popular culture. One of the most popular novel is Roxolana, about the Ukrainian woman who was basically sold on the market, and she became the wife of the Ottoman Sultan, right? So this is a very famous episode, or kind of a reference, a trope in popular culture as well. But the Cossacks played a very important role in what you say, liberating slaves at the time. But it was obviously not only women, because they would also take young men for labor and serving as basically labor force for the Ottomans. And this was also one of the tasks of not kind of task, but one of the activities, so to say, of the Cossacks when they were fighting the Ottomans.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have one question about this agreement between the Russian Tsar and Bogdan Khmelnytsky in Pereyaslav. after the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1654. So what was the context of this agreement? What were the conditions? And what is the importance of this treaty for Ukraine?
This is another very good question, because it's also, there is no definite answer. I don't know if you know, but there is no original of the Pereyaslav agreement. So historians can't really, they don't have the document itself to work with it. But it's important to understand that for the Cossacks, for Bogdan Khmelnytsky, especially the leader, the hetman, the leader of the Cossacks, this agreement was seen, and this is what we also see from other sources. This agreement was a mere military alliance in their war with Poland. They were seeking support. They were seeking military support from Russia, and basically they found it through this. What they believe, they found it through this agreement. But at the same time, for Russia, this was an opportunity to expand their influence over the Cossack territories, and what they later used to justify this attempt to gather the Russian lands. And this is why it's so important, because afterwards, after this agreement, we don't see Ukraine as an independent player anymore. Then the next key moment in history is 1667. This is the treaty of the Truce of Andrusovo, or between Russia and Poland, when these two countries, when Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, they agreed to split the Ukrainian lands in half along the Dnieper River. So one half, the right bank Ukraine, would belong to the Commonwealth, and the left bank Ukraine would belong to Russia. And afterwards, Russia starts its expansion to the south as well, in a series of successful wars with the Ottoman Empire. They seize the south of Ukraine, later Crimea, and basically this is a beginning of their expansion, so to say, to the southwest, and this is also the beginning of Russian greatness in Europe, we can say, because in a very short while, already in the 18th century, Poland, Lithuania would be partitioned between Prussia, Austria, and Russia was one of, like, kind of perhaps the main initiator of this partition. And why this treaty is so important for both Ukraine and Russia is that indeed during the Soviet times, the Pereyaslav Agreement was celebrated as the unification of Ukraine and Russia, as basically kind of bringing Ukraine back to its origin, back to Russia, back to Moscow. And this is why we also see a lot of monuments erected in 1954. This was the 300-year celebration of the Union as the fraternity of people. And this was also the same year when Crimea was sort of given to Ukraine symbolically as a present to celebrate this unification. And it is also symbolic that this Pereyaslav Agreement, in the context of war, those monuments are being destroyed and basically kind of trying to reclaim history, right? Although there is no original document, historians are trying to show that for the Cossacks' perspective, for the Ukrainian perspective, it was a military alliance and not the unification, as it has been long explained by Soviet and Russian historians.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, or like a little bit odd, that because you said, for example, that it was celebrated as Ukraine coming like back to its origins, like Russia. And I think it's interesting because actually we talked about this empire, which is the Kiev Rus. So I think it's interesting that it's often not said the other way around, like Russia coming back to Ukraine. Like why is Russia the big player and always the powerful guy when the very center of of this empire was actually in Kiev and not in Moscow?
Well, the Kiev really lost its power, right, in with the Mongol invasion. So the Kievan Rus was partitioned, so to say, as well. Is like I mentioned already, the Halych-Volhynia Principality. We can say that this was the successor of the Kievan Rus, but at the same time there was this Moscovia. Moscovia was also a successor of the Kievan Rus, right? And at the same time as Halych-Volhynia Principality became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, and also we can say was erased, you know, like kind of diminished in power and strength. Moscow was growing in importance. So we speak about a few centuries in between. So by that time, Moscow became yet another center, right, a more powerful center. And from their perspective, this was going back to the Kievan Rus, but this Kievan Rus was at the same time seen as the origin of the Moscow state. So yeah, it's kind of how you tell the story, and this is what we are talking about here, right? How you explain what happened, and from whose perspective you tell this story.
Yeah, okay. That's why I was a bit confused. Thanks for clarifying. Now we actually want to make a very big leap in time, and we want to go to the time of the Soviet Union. Putin talks about this a lot, and he talked about Stalin and Lenin, about the differences between them, and he was especially critical with Lenin. So our question would be, where are the differences between their views on nationalism, especially, and the ideal structure of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I would perhaps start answering this question with a reference to 2017. This was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and how little this event was celebrated in Russia. Because in a way, and this is the reference to your question, that that Putin criticizes Lenin, right? He criticizes the revolution is sort of uncomfortable event in the Russian history because it led to the breakup of the great Russian Empire, and in a way, Putin with his rewriting of history is trying to go back in time to this might of the Russian Empire, to its territorial extent as well, and trying to sort of rectify what Lenin in a way destroyed. But when we speak about the differences between Stalin's and Lenin's views on nationalism, and how this played out in the formation of the Soviet Union, is indeed we can speak about two very different approaches and views, what the future Soviet Union would look like. And this was an ongoing debate during the Civil War, so ever since 1917. And Lenin was in favor. So Lenin, we should also understand his views as part of this bigger sort of bigger desire to have a world revolution, that the revolution would not only take place in Russia, that it's not only a Russian story, but it's the world story. So he was aspiring for this world revolution. And from this perspective, for Lenin, this great Russian chauvinism or Russian nationalism was very dangerous, because who would support the revolution if it means recreating the empire? Who would support the revolution if it would mean, you know, a sort of Russian nationalism? So from this perspective, he thought, or he supported even the kind of those nationalist movements in the imperial peripheries, but also later on, we can see how the Soviet Union, through Comintern, supported national liberation movements anywhere in the world, seeing it as a way to destabilize and weaken those metropoles like France and Great Britain and so on. But yes, as I said, Lenin, in a way, it was of course tactical, but he supported local nationalist movements. And when we speak about the formation of the Soviet Union, Lenin as well, he did not want to have a centralized Russia, to which those republics kind of well, I shouldn't perhaps go back a little bit to the Civil War, because during the Civil War period and after 1917, a lot of basically new governments were established throughout on the territories of former Russian Empire. We can speak of the independent Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Finland became independent. In Ukraine, we also have the Ukrainian People's Republic, in Belarus as well. Same attempts were made in the Caucasus. So basically, nationalism, those nationalist movements were already a reality. This wasn't something theoretical. So it wasn't like Lenin was thinking, what shall we do with nationalism? They were faced with those successful at times, and at times not very successful national governments, and they needed to offer an alternative, so to say. And this is why a centralized Soviet Union was not an option, because it would mean to, again, kind of to show, to set a bad example, to say that it's all about Russia, about recreating Russia. They needed to endorse somehow this local nationalism, but also make it work in their favor. What we see in December 1922, when the Soviet Union was created, is that the Soviet Union included or was formed out of Russia, but also Ukraine, Belarus, and then it was a Republic of Transcaucasia. So those were, we can say, equal members, and they were formally independent, right? So each country had its own constitution, but at the same, so this was a union of more or less quasi-independent, we can say, state. Instead, Stalin's approach from the very beginning was very different. He wished to integrate or incorporate really those formerly independent Soviet republics as part of Russian Soviet Federation with rights of autonomy. So we can speak of kind of two different perspectives: Lenin, who favored this federalization, and Stalin, who favored autonomization, so to say. And in Stalin's view, the government of the Russian Federation would become the central institutions of Soviet rule, and they would exercise control over formally autonomous republics. But as I said, that in 1922, the Soviet Union included those separate republics, but it was a compromise, because while this independence was somehow protected through the formation of this, through the makeup of the Soviet Union, real power remained with Russia, because the party was a centralized institution. There was indeed like a Ukrainian Communist Party of Bolshevik, a Belarusian Communist Party of Bolsheviks, but all the decisions were made centrally in Moscow. And another important fact is that those Soviet republics were forced to give up or to centralize, so to say, the most important ministries. So, for instance, the Ministry of Military or Foreign Affairs or Transportation, they were all managed through Moscow, and Ukraine could have an independent Ministry of Education, for instance. So there was a separation, and this is how, on the one hand, those republics were in the sort of independent. This was a federation, but on the other hand, they didn't really have a real power within their borders.
Okay, so you have explained that the political power was pretty much centralized in Moscow, but to make this a little bit more understandable, what would this mean for things like Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian language, music, literature? Was this something that was very much alive during the Soviet Union, or was it more suppressed?
But this is an excellent question. It's actually the culture during the interwar period. This was or kind of the development of the cultural sphere during the interwar period. This is my specialism. This is what I was working on for my PhD thesis in my first book, and this is exactly as I said. those most important ministries, or those ministries which were deemed most important, were managed and managed via Moscow, and culture or education, they were seemed or regarded as less important, so they were sort of left in control of the local governors, of the party leaders. As we can see from the experience of Ukraine during the interwar years, this was a huge mistake of the authorities in Moscow, because culture is never just about culture, right? It's never just about, you know, the music we compose or the books we write. And we can see in the interwar years how very quickly those demands for cultural autonomy gained very political they became political. The debate became political, because while developing, I don't know, writing books in Ukrainian, there were questions. So who the audience is? We should perhaps Ukrainize those Russian-speaking workers in Russian-speaking urban centers, and so on and so on. And so we have the minister, the commissariat, so-called for education, which was responsible for the entire cultural sphere, education, primary and higher education, and they are implemented their policies more or less independently during the interwar years, at least. And at the same time, they are pushing for more autonomy, which means also more money, to pour more money into Ukrainian culture, to support kind of Ukrainian activists, Ukrainian artists, which soon later on in the end of the 1920s would become what they would call a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism. Because as I said, culture is never just about writing books or composing music. It always has this question of control, of distribution of resources, and so on and so on. And as we can see from the experience of Ukraine in the 1930s, you know, with all the persecutions and purges which started against Ukrainians, those most active in this cultural sphere, is that from Moscow perspective, they saw it the same, that they realized their mistake, that they basically allowed Ukraine to develop its culture, which became as well means of some sort of political discussion.
Yeah, so I think the next question is also very much tied to culture. So we fast forward in time once more. We're now in the mid to late 1980s, and the Soviet Union is starting to disintegrate. Like, one of the reasons often associated with this breakup, I think, is rising nationalism within the bloc. And in his speech, Putin makes it seem as if mainly economic hardships and power-hungry politicians caused these nationalist feelings. So first of all, I'm curious, like, can you give us some more context as to which nationalist movements were present in the area more generally before the Soviet Union?
Well, it's a good question, and I think as you already said, there are a lot of contributing factors to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and no one factor can be you know, sort of singled out. It was economic collapse. It was, of course, political, so kind of political disintegration in the foreign policy. It was also the rise of nationalism, but at the same time, more generally, there was this perhaps ideological rejection of communism, because we see on the international stage that you know, the Soviet Union didn't really fulfill its promises, and basically there was generally an ideological perhaps weakness of communism became obvious. So all this together combine plus the policies of the then you know, leader, the Soviet leader Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, it basically, and what he his glasnost, this openness and restructuring of the Soviet Union, perestroika, it all kind of came together, and all those local grievances enhanced by economic hardships, and of course the you know, what you mentioned, these power hungry politicians, local politicians, they saw an opportunity, so to say, to get more control in their hands. And it's very interesting, and perhaps it's unique to Ukraine is that Ukrainian first like the declaration of Ukraine's autonomy and independence was proclaimed by the communists, right? By the communist leaders of the time. So it wasn't like in the Baltic states when some nationally kind of the non-Soviet actors became active. In Ukraine, it was actually the communists who declared independence.